In a time long ago, when knights wore shining armor and the stars above Europe sparkled with mystery, a great story began to unfold. A tale of faith, courage, and dreams that would stretch across mountains, seas, and golden deserts. In the late 11th century, the world of Europe and the Middle East was filled with wonder and tension. The Byzantine Empire, once the eastern heart of Rome, stood proudly yet nervously, watching as Turkish armies advanced through their lands. Emperor Alexios, wise yet desperate, looked to the west and sent word across kingdoms and forests, calling for help. Far across the continent, the people of Europe lived under the rule of feudal lords, where brave knights roamed and churches rose like beacons to the heavens. Their lives were guided by devotion, and many dreamed of walking where Jesus once walked, in the sacred city of Jerusalem. When Pope Urban II spoke at a council one crisp November day in 1095, he told of Christian lands taken, holy places defiled, and brothers in the East who needed aid. His voice rose with passion, and his words spread like wine through the trees. God wills it, the people cried. Thus, the First Crusade began, a journey that would lead tens of thousands across rivers and valleys, through snow and sun, to the gates of ancient cities. The first to set out were not mighty kings, but common folk, peasants, monks, and wandering warriors led by a man called Peter the Hermit. They marched with hope but little skill, and soon many met sorrow before even reaching the Holy Land. Behind them came noble lords, proud and well-armed, Godfrey, Raymond, Bohemond, and others, each carrying dreams of glory, faith, and redemption. Through battles and sieges, hunger and heat, they marched. They stood before the grand city of Antioch, whose walls were tall and fierce. There, they endured a long siege, and when hope flickered, a peasant's dream of a sacred lance revived their spirits. In the end, the city fell, and their journey continued. At last, they reached Jerusalem, the shining goal of their dreams, and on July 15th, 1099, they scaled its walls and claimed it. Though the battle was fierce and sorrowful, to the Crusaders it was a triumph unlike any other. A new kingdom was born that day, ruled not by a king, but by a man called Godfrey, who humbly took the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. He ruled with courage, and when he passed, his brother Baldwin became the first king. The world watched in awe. For a time, peace reigned under the stars of the East, but time never stands still. Years passed, and the winds of change returned. The county of Edessa fell in 1144, and once more, Europe listened as calls echoed for a second crusade. This time, kings themselves answered, Louis of France and Conrad of Germany, and even a queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, rode with the banners of faith. Their journey was long, and though their hearts were strong, the path was harder than they dreamed. Across hills and rivers, they marched, and though the cities they wished to save remained beyond their reach, their story, like the first, lived on in the whispers of wind and song. And so, dear dreamer, as the stars blink above you and the world slows to a hush, know that long ago, brave souls walked across continents not only for power, but for belief, for redemption, and for a dream of peace in a sacred place. Their footsteps echo still, like lullabies of the past, reminding us that even in the darkest hours, there are those who dare to hope. Sleep now, and may your dreams carry you to the lands of old, where castles rise from mist and the tales of yesterday become lullabies of night. As winter descended upon the rugged terrain of Anatolia, the German forces under Conrad III faced mounting hardships, their numbers steadily diminishing under the combined weight of starvation, hostile ambushes, and the punishing cold that gripped the highlands. Weakened and demoralized, the remnants of Conrad's army limped back to Constantinople, where they awaited reinforcements and struggled to maintain cohesion amidst rising tensions with their Byzantine hosts. King Louis VII of France, whose troops arrived later and were better provisioned, attempted to press onward, but he too encountered fierce Turkish resistance in the interior of Anatolia. At the Battle of Mount Cadmus, The French army was ambushed and nearly annihilated, forcing Louis to abandon the overland route and instead proceed by sea from Italia to the Levantine coast. By the time both royal contingents regrouped in the Holy Land, their forces were but a shadow of the grand armies that had set out from Europe. In Jerusalem, plans were drawn for a grand assault on the Muslim-held city of Damascus, a campaign intended to reassert Christian strength and reclaim momentum lost after the fall of Edessa. In July 1148, the combined Crusader army launched its siege of Damascus, but political disunity, lack of local support, and fierce Muslim resistance soon unraveled the effort. After just 4 days, the siege was abandoned in disgrace, and the Crusades' momentum evaporated under the scorching sun and bitter recriminations between its leaders. The failure of the Second Crusade marked a turning point, eroding the aura of divine favor that had surrounded the First Crusade and casting doubt upon the ability of Christian Europe to maintain its foothold in the Holy Land. Yet the story did not end there, for as years passed, new leaders would emerge from both Christian and Muslim worlds, reshaping the conflict in even more profound ways. In the East, a new force began to rise under the leadership of a remarkable Kurdish commander named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Latin West as Saladin. Born in Tikrit and trained in the military tradition of the Zengid dynasty, Saladin rose to prominence under the patronage of Nur ad-Din, the formidable ruler of Aleppo and Damascus. Upon Nur ad-Din's death, Saladin skillfully consolidated power, eventually unifying Egypt and Syria under his rule and founding the Ayyubid dynasty. His leadership brought unprecedented coordination to the Muslim response to the Crusader presence, and his reputation for chivalry and piety would echo through history. In 1187, Saladin launched a campaign that would culminate in the decisive Battle of Hattin. On a sweltering July day near the Sea of Galilee, the Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, marched to relieve the besieged city of Tiberias, only to fall into a carefully laid trap. Deprived of water and encircled by Saladin's forces, the Crusaders were annihilated and their leaders taken prisoner. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, was captured, and within months, nearly every Crusader stronghold across the Kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem, reclaiming the holy city for Islam after nearly a century of Latin rule. News of Jerusalem's fall shocked Christendom and set in motion the Third Crusade, the most illustrious and storied of all crusading expeditions. Monarchs of legendary stature took the cross: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Each brought vast armies and royal ambition, but the enterprise was again beset by rivalry, hardship, and the complexities of long-distance war. Frederick drowned while crossing a river in Cilicia, scattering his army. Philip and Richard quarreled fiercely, and after capturing Acre together, Philip returned to France, leaving Richard to lead the campaign alone. Richard proved a brilliant commander, winning a series of battles against Saladin and earning his reputation as a warrior king. Yet despite his victories, including the fierce engagement at Arsuf, Richard was unable to retake Jerusalem. Instead, he negotiated a treaty with Saladin in 1192 that secured Christian access to holy sites, but left the city in Muslim hands. Though the Third Crusade failed to achieve its ultimate aim, it restored a fragile balance and brought a temporary end to large-scale hostilities. Over the following decades, smaller expeditions would follow, each struggling to adapt to the changing realities of the Eastern Mediterranean. One such expedition, the Fourth Crusade, veered wildly off course. Originally intended to strike at Egypt, the crusade was diverted through Venetian influence and internal intrigue toward Constantinople. In 1204, the Crusaders sacked the Byzantine capital in one of history's most shocking betrayals. The great city, seat of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, was plundered by Latin Christian knights, and the Byzantine Empire was fractured. The episode deepened the East-West schism and planted seeds of resentment that would last for centuries. Amid these shifting tides, the idea of crusading itself began to evolve, no longer confined to the Holy Land. Papal sanction for crusades was extended to campaigns against heretics in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, and political enemies of the Pope in Italy. Crusading rhetoric became a powerful political tool used to legitimize war and consolidate authority. Meanwhile, in the Levant, the Crusader states struggled to maintain their fragile hold. Successive campaigns, such as the Fifth and Sixth Crusades, met with limited and temporary success. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, achieved a peaceful acquisition of Jerusalem in 1229 through diplomatic means, but this arrangement was short-lived. In 1244, the city was sacked again by Khwarezmian mercenaries allied with Egypt, ending Latin Christian presence in the city for good. A final crescendo came with the rise of the Mamluk sultans in Egypt, formidable warrior slaves who overthrew their Ayyubid masters and ushered in a new era of Islamic military resurgence. Under leaders such as Baybars and Calawan, the Mamluks launched systematic campaigns to eliminate the remaining Crusader outposts. Acre, the last major stronghold of the Crusaders, fell in 1291 after a brutal siege, marking the end of nearly 2 centuries of Latin Christian rule in the Holy Land. Yet the legacy of the Crusades lived on, not merely in the ruins of fortresses or in medieval chronicles, but in the deeper currents of cultural memory, religious thought, and historical identity. The Crusades shaped the contours of Christian and Muslim interaction for generations, inspiring legends, resentment, heroism, and sorrow. They bridged continents and ideologies, and though they ultimately failed to secure lasting control of Jerusalem, they created enduring narratives of sacrifice, valor, and divine purpose. As the stars glittered high above medieval Europe and distant desert sands, and as pilgrims whispered prayers in ancient chapels or stood in awe before crumbling ramparts, the long echo of Crusader footsteps remained etched in stone and soul, woven forever into the tapestry of human history. In the centuries that followed the fall of Acre, Europe and the Islamic world underwent profound transformations, reshaped by the political, religious, and cultural consequences of the crusading era. For though the age of formal crusades to the Holy Land had ended, the spirit of religious confrontation and ideological struggle endured, manifesting in new forms across the continent and beyond its shores. The memory of the Crusades persisted in Western Europe, not only in monastic chronicles and epic poems, but also in the evolving concept of Christian identity, forged in opposition to the Islamic world and bound to the sanctity of Jerusalem as an eternal spiritual aspiration. Military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, though displaced from the Levant, continue to play roles in European politics and warfare, with the Hospitallers establishing a base on the island of Rhodes and later Malta, where they resisted Ottoman incursions and preserved a legacy of crusading chivalry long after the original goals had faded. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the victories over the Crusaders were remembered as signs of divine favor and heroic resistance, inspiring poets, chroniclers, and future leaders who would cast themselves in the mold of Saladin, upholding the sacred duty of defending Islam from foreign intrusion. The Mamluk Sultanate that had driven out the Crusaders would itself fall in the early 16th century to the rising power of the Ottoman Empire, a formidable Muslim polity that absorbed much of the Middle East and the Balkans, and which would come to embody, in European eyes, the new Eastern menace, replacing the older fear of Saracens and desert warriors with the might of a disciplined empire stretching from Algiers to Baghdad. As the Renaissance dawned in Europe, the papacy sought to rekindle the crusading flame, now directing it against Ottoman forces and Protestant reformers alike, repurposing the spiritual authority once wielded to liberate Jerusalem toward new internal and external threats. Yet the world was changing. The age of exploration, launched by Iberian seafarers such as Prince Henry the Navigator and Christopher Columbus, opened vast new frontiers across the Atlantic, shifting Europe's gaze away from the eastern Mediterranean and toward the riches and souls of Africa, Asia, and the New World. This expansion carried with it echoes of the crusading ethos. Conquistadors invoking the cross as they marched through Aztec temples and Incan fortresses, missionaries baptizing entire tribes in the name of Christ, and colonizers invoking divine providence as they laid claim to distant lands. The old dichotomy of Christian versus Muslim was now entangled with questions of civilization, empire, and economic ambition, blending spiritual motives with the drive for gold, spices, and territory. In the East, the Ottomans clashed repeatedly with European powers, most famously at the sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683, battles that reignited crusading rhetoric and stirred memories of earlier struggles for Christendom survival. Yet even amid such conflict, exchanges of knowledge, trade, and diplomacy persisted, and the legacy of the Crusades became not only one of war, but of cultural entanglement. Where Arabic medical texts translated in Crusader hospitals, architectural motifs carried westward, and philosophical debates about faith and reason found strange common ground between monastic scholars and Islamic thinkers. By the 18th century, Enlightenment writers revisited the Crusades with skepticism, casting them as misguided adventures fueled by fanaticism and superstition, while Romantic poets and painters later revived them with nostalgic grandeur, portraying crusaders as tragic heroes in shining armor, torn between duty and love, faith and folly. In the 19th century, as European empires expanded across the Muslim world from Algeria to India, colonial powers began to draw upon Crusader imagery to justify their presence, constructing a historical lineage that linked their modern domination to ancient spiritual mandates, while in response, Arab intellectuals and nationalists reclaimed Saladin as a symbol of anti-imperial resistance, reinterpreting the Crusades through the lens of modern struggle. The 20th century saw the rise of new ideological battles, global wars, decolonization, and geopolitical tensions in the Middle East that often evoked the ghosts of the Crusades, especially as Western interventions in the region were portrayed by both critics and local populations as echoes of medieval aggression. The founding of Israel in 1948, the ensuing Arab-Israeli conflicts, and Western involvement in the oil-rich lands of the Middle East all contributed to a narrative, particularly in Islamist thought, that framed modern struggles as a continuation of Crusader imperialism. Osama bin Laden and other jihadist figures explicitly referred to American and European forces in Muslim lands as crusaders, resurrecting the term with potent political charge, while in the West, political rhetoric often invoked the idea of a civilizational clash, drawing simplistic lines between East and West, Islam and Christianity, modernity and tradition. Yet beneath these headlines and slogans, historians continued to delve into the Crusades with nuance, uncovering not just tales of conquest and resistance, but also cooperation, coexistence, and shared humanity. Pilgrims still journeyed to Jerusalem, not as warriors but as seekers of peace, walking among stones once stained by blood, yet now echoing with silent prayers, while museums, textbooks, and documentaries re-examine the Crusades not as a monolithic era of religious war, but as a complex, multifaceted chapter in the long and tangled history of human aspiration, belief, and ambition. And so, the story of the Crusades endures, not as a tale with a clear beginning or end, but as a mirror through which each generation sees its own values, fears, and dreams reflected in the armor of knights, the minarets of citadels, the desert winds, and the distant bells of ancient cathedrals. As the modern world pressed forward into the 21st century, the shadow of the Crusades lingered not just in textbooks and museums, but in the very frameworks by which societies defined themselves and others. For the medieval campaigns to the Holy Land had long since transcended their original historical context, becoming symbols, metaphors, and rallying cries invoked in debates over religion, nationalism, global order, and cultural heritage, with both the West and the Islamic world continuing to shape their identities through the legacy of that turbulent era. In academic circles, the study of the Crusades evolved into a multidisciplinary exploration, drawing from archaeology, comparative theology, art history, and literary criticism, to reveal the interwoven threads of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish experiences that unfolded not only in battle, but in diplomacy, trade, intermarriage, and translation, challenging earlier narratives that had painted the period in simplistic hues of good and evil, east and west, light and darkness. In the public sphere, however, popular culture often leaned into more dramatic and reductive portrayals, as seen in films like Kingdom of Heaven and video games such as Assassin's Creed, which resurrected the imagery of Templars, Saracens, and holy quests with cinematic flair, blending fact with fiction to entertain modern audiences while also, at times, reinforcing old tropes of religious rivalry and martial heroism. Meanwhile, political leaders and pundits occasionally resurrected Crusader language in contexts far removed from medieval warfare, whether in speeches during the so-called War on Terror or in the rise of right-wing nationalist movements across Europe that cast themselves as defenders of Christian civilization against perceived Islamic encroachment, drawing symbolic inspiration from events centuries past to justify contemporary exclusion and fear. This instrumentalization of history was met by a countercurrent of intellectual resistance, scholars, educators, and activists working to dismantle the weaponization of the past by contextualizing the Crusades as a deeply complex phenomenon rooted in medieval theology, papal politics, feudal ambition, an apocalyptic yearning rather than in eternal truths about cultural superiority or divine destiny. Yet the challenge remained. For the emotional resonance of the Crusades, its imagery of armored knights riding beneath blood-red crosses, its tales of sieges and relics, its invocations of sacred space and spiritual duty, proved remarkably enduring, especially in a world still grappling with the tensions between religious identity and secular modernity, between globalization and cultural memory. In cities from London to Cairo, Jerusalem to Istanbul, echoes of that ancient struggle resounded in architecture, place names, church rituals, and even family lineages, while in cyberspace, where ideas moved faster than armies ever had, crusading language was reappropriated by extremists of various stripes. From militant Islamists framing their cause as a defense against modern-day crusaders to Western supremacists cloaking xenophobia in the armor of imagined medieval valor. At the same time, interfaith dialogue blossomed in other quarters as rabbis, imams, and priests gathered to revisit the painful past, not to stoke resentment, but to promote reconciliation, drawing upon the shared Abrahamic roots of their faiths and the lessons of history's tragic cycles to seek common ground. In education, progressive curricula introduced students to Muslim perspectives on the Crusades, to the stories of Jewish communities caught in the crossfire, and to the internal diversity within both Christian and Islamic societies, where theological debates, political rivalries, and local alliances often proved more influential than grand religious ideology. Even tourism played a role in shaping modern memory, as visitors to Crusader castles in Syria, Israel, and Cyprus confronted the ruins of ambition and violence, walking through silent corridors once filled with battle cries and prayers, now echoing with questions of identity, faith, and purpose. The enduring presence of the Crusades in the Western imagination became a reflection of how history is both a record and a lens, a chronicle of what was and a mirror of what is feared or desired, serving not only as a field of study, but as a battleground for narrative power in shaping the worldview of future generations. As technology accelerated and global crises such as climate change, pandemics, and mass migration emerged as the defining issues of the age, some began to question whether the preoccupation with religious pasts like the Crusades might give way to more inclusive, planetary concerns, or whether those deep-rooted identities would continue to shape how humanity responds to shared challenges. For beneath the politics and the pageantry, the myths and the manuscripts, the Crusades remained at their core a story about humanity's search for meaning, about how men and women across faiths, centuries, and continents have risked everything for the sacred, whether that sacred was a city, a belief, a vision of heaven, or the fragile hope of redemption. And in remembering that, perhaps we might yet write new chapters not of conquest and division, but of understanding and healing, born not from the clash of swords, but from the courage to listen and learn across time. And as the narrative of the Crusades continued to ripple through the collective consciousness of both East and West, its presence evolved not only in public discourse and political rhetoric, but in the intimate realms of literature, psychology, and moral imagination, where generations of thinkers, artists, and storytellers grappled with the paradoxes of faith and violence, of sacred duty entangled with bloodshed, of longing for transcendence shadowed by human frailty, for from Dante's Divine Comedy to Walter Scott's The Talisman, from medieval mystery plays to modern graphic novels, the Crusades serve as a canvas onto which cultures projected their hopes and their horrors, their ideals of chivalry and sacrifice interwoven with their darkest impulses toward domination and erasure. The romanticized image of the noble crusader endured for centuries in European art, often cleansed of its brutality and sanctified by the aesthetics of oil and marble, where gleaming armor and divine light cloaked what were often massacres and sieges, while the Islamic memory of the Crusades, embodied in figures like Saladin, transformed from historical leaders into symbols of just resistance, valor, and wisdom in the face of foreign incursion. Their stories passed down through poetry, folklore, and later nationalist revival as the Middle East reawakened to its own medieval past in the context of colonial struggles and modern identity building. Meanwhile, in the corridors of universities and the pages of academic journals, historians delved deeper into the granular realities of the crusading era, studying not only the politics of Rome and Byzantium or the theological treatises of Bernard of Clairvaux, but the logistical records of grain shipments, the contracts of mercenary forces, the letters of bewildered pilgrims, the graffiti left in church walls by unknown hands who had traveled halfway across the world for reasons they may never have fully understood. And in these fragments emerged a more human story, stripped of myth yet no less compelling. One of yearning, confusion, loss, and the unpredictable consequences of idealism entangled with institutional power. Psychohistorical studies even began to analyze the internal landscapes of those who went on crusade. What it meant to believe that killing in God's name was not only permitted but sanctified, what psychological costs such belief carried for those who returned haunted by what they had seen or done, and how societies absolved or ignored those inner wounds through ceremony, song, and silence. In this way, the Crusades were no longer only about geopolitics or theology, but about the moral architecture of Western civilization itself, its long tradition of defining righteousness through struggle and its difficulty in separating spiritual aspiration from conquest. In popular fiction, especially in postmodern works, this tension became fertile ground for re-examination, as authors inverted traditional roles, humanized the so-called enemy, and used the medieval framework to explore themes of fanaticism, trauma, othering, and redemption, revealing the timeless nature of crusading not as a historical event alone, but as a recurring human pattern. Whether in religious warfare, ideological extremism, or even cultural imperialism masked as salvation. In classrooms, educators struggled with how to present these truths to students raised on sanitized myths, weighing the need for historical accuracy against the emotional and ethical weight of inherited narratives. While in digital spaces, social media fueled new waves of reinterpretation, distortion, and sometimes outright manipulation as memes, conspiracy theories, and politically charged hashtags co-opted crusading imagery for movements far removed from medieval Christendom. Museums and exhibitions, particularly in Europe and Middle East, responded by curating more inclusive, critical, and nuanced displays. Juxtaposing Christian relics with Islamic manuscripts, Crusader armor with the accounts of displaced communities, battle maps with timelines of cultural exchange, offering visitors not only a glimpse into the violent past, but a mirror to examine their own assumptions and cultural legacies. Yet even as this deeper awareness grew, The emotional potency of the Crusades endured, because the human need to divide the world into sacred and profane, chosen and condemned, still echoed in the bones of modern ideologies. And unless confronted honestly, these historical archetypes risked becoming templates for future cycles of division. Still, there was hope in the very act of re-examination, in the courage to ask not only what happened, but why it mattered, and what it says about who we are and who we might become. For in the ruins of Antioch and the mosaics of Jerusalem, in the sermons that once inspired warriors and the songs that mourned the dead, lies a vast archive of human striving toward meaning, toward belonging, toward eternity. And perhaps it is in acknowledging that shared striving, with all its missteps and miracles, that we may begin to transform the legacy of the Crusades from one of inherited conflict to one of shared reflection, where the past is not a battlefield to be reclaimed, but a landscape to be understood and, through understanding, transcended. And so as the reflections deepened and the once revered figures of Crusader and Caliph were peeled away from the safety of marble pedestal and romantic myth, new dialogues began to emerge in the corridors of global scholarship and interfaith cooperation, where theologians, historians, and peace builders sought not merely to deconstruct the violence of the past, but to identify the echoes that still resonate within contemporary identities. For the Crusades did not end in 1291 with the fall of Acre, nor were they confined to Latin papal edicts or the fortresses of Outremer. They lived on in the transmission of texts, in the reawakening of classical knowledge rescued through contact with Islamic scholars, in the legalistic frameworks of just war that shaped emerging Western norms, and in the philosophical dilemmas faced by modern states torn between secular principles and the lingering shadows of religious entitlement. And so even as cities were rebuilt and empires collapsed, the moral architecture born in the medieval struggle continued to influence how societies defined themselves in relation to the other, how they justified intervention, and how they constructed collective memory around trauma and triumph alike. The legacy of the Crusades embedded itself into modern geopolitical narratives, particularly during the colonial era, when European powers invoked echoes of Christian dominion to frame their expansions into the Middle East and North Africa, cloaking imperial ambition in civilizing rhetoric eerily reminiscent of medieval papal bulls, while resistance movements within colonized territories often drew strength from historical memory, casting their struggle as a continuation of the defense against crusading forces, thereby giving birth to competing mythologies that shaped national identities and foreign policy alike. In art and cinema, these narratives were revived again and again, from the Orientalist fantasies of 19th century painters to the sweeping epics of Hollywood, where sword and cross rode side by side, often simplifying the deeply complex interplay of cultures into a binary tale of hero and villain. Yet in recent decades, more nuanced storytelling emerged in film, literature, and even video games, portraying both Christian and Muslim characters as morally multifaceted, bound not by archetypes, but by the same human doubts, desires, and contradictions that shaped their real historical counterparts. In the realm of education, initiatives grew to place Crusade studies within broader frameworks of global history and cross-cultural exchange, highlighting how the violent collisions also produced unexpected syntheses. Architectural techniques exchanged between East and West, culinary influences that crossed borders through war and trade, philosophical and mathematical ideas preserved by Islamic scholars and reintroduced into Europe through the crucible of contact, all reminding us that even in the darkest of human enterprises, there are unintended bridges formed, though often at immense cost. Museums began curating traveling exhibits that juxtaposed the weaponry of knights with the poetry of Sufi mystics, that displayed both siege engines and illuminated manuscripts, asking visitors not to choose sides, but to dwell in the discomfort of complexity, where moral certainty dissolves and the imperative becomes not conquest, but comprehension. In public memory, commemorations of the Crusades began to shift, no longer mere romanticized reenactments or selective invocations, but meditative moments to reflect on how myths born in blood still shape borders, migration policies, and national mythologies today, particularly in regions where religion remains intertwined with political identity and ancestral trauma is passed from generation to generation. In international relations, the rhetoric of crusade has reemerged at times, sometimes as political provocation, sometimes as dog whistle, demonstrating how easily the past can be weaponized in the present unless countered by education and empathy, for it is not enough to archive the Crusades as a distant chapter of medieval history. They remain a mirror, revealing the perennial temptation to clothe violence in virtue, to mask ambition with holiness, to divide the world into sacred self and profane other. Yet within the growing body of interdisciplinary work, from psychohistorical studies that explore generational trauma to theological dialogues that confront uncomfortable truths about sacred texts and collective guilt, to grassroots storytelling initiatives where descendants of crusaders and those from former Islamic caliphates share their inherited memories, there's a flicker of something deeper, a shared recognition that the work of healing historical wounds does not lie in rewriting the past, but in re-experiencing it through the lens of others. And in that act, in the quiet humility of listening to the pain that history left behind, and the courage to dismantle inherited myths, perhaps humanity can begin not only to understand the Crusades, but to unlearn their patterns, to reimagine conflict not as destiny, but as warning, to build a world where faith no longer demands the sword, where memory becomes a teacher, not a weapon, and where the true pilgrimage is not across oceans or deserts, but into the difficult terrain of mutual understanding. And as these interwoven narratives continued to unravel across disciplines and generations, the realization took deeper root that the legacy of the Crusades was not confined to battlefield relics or ancient scrolls, but rather lived on in the stones of cities, in the silhouettes of churches and mosques standing within sight of one another, in the alleys of Jerusalem where Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin once clashed and coexisted, in the architectural hybridity that emerged when Gothic arches met. Islamic Makarnas, when castles built by Frankish lords bore Islamic engineering beneath their battlements, and when the very idea of sacred space became a contested yet shared inheritance. This architectural palimpsest, written and rewritten with each conquest and retaking, came to symbolize the paradox of the Crusades, that what was meant to divide also inadvertently fused cultures together, often by force, often in grief, but always leaving behind traces that no ideology could fully erase. In cities like Acre and Antioch, archaeological digs uncovered layers of human presence. Byzantine mosaics beneath Crusader cathedrals, Islamic inscriptions buried beneath Latin chapels, telling a quiet story of overlapping sovereignties and forgotten cohabitations, of soldiers and pilgrims who traded not only steel but stories, who shared markets, water sources, even moments of peace, which seldom made it into the chronicles written by generals or monks but lived on in the whispered oral. Histories passed through local families whose ancestry defied neat categorization. These forgotten human threads wove a parallel history that stood apart from the grand narratives of conquest and piety, a history of women left behind to manage homes in times of war, of merchants who learned foreign tongues to survive, of children born of interfaith unions that both scandalized and softened hardened boundaries, all of whom bore witness to a world far more complicated than the banners of Cross and Crescent would allow. Meanwhile, in the realm of psychological and sociological inquiry, scholars began to examine the Crusades not only as historical events, but as long-term carriers of cultural trauma and mythic identity, exploring how repeated invocations of the Crusader ideal influenced nationalist movements in Europe, how the memory of siege and invasion remained etched into the collective consciousness of Islamic societies, and how both sides developed symbolic vocabularies rooted in fear, pride, and vengeance that could be triggered centuries later by seemingly unrelated geopolitical events, creating cycles of perception and misperception that no treaty or policy could fully dismantle. From the Balkans to the Levant, from Western Europe to North Africa, people continued to wrestle with what it meant to inherit a past not of their making, but still embedded in their social institutions, their textbooks, their religious rituals, even in the silhouettes of their flags, some of which still bore crosses or crescents, as if unable or unwilling to move beyond the sacred dichotomies born during the Age of Crusade. Yet in the arts, a quieter revolution was taking place. Composers blending Byzantine chants with Arabic makam, poets drawing inspiration from Andalusian mystics and Provençal troubadours alike, filmmakers daring to portray Templars and Saracens not as enemies, but as brothers betrayed by larger political games, and authors who crafted epics that did not end in victory or conversion, but in shared mourning over what was lost. Not only lives and cities, but the possibility of what could have been. Had peace taken root instead of war? Educational initiatives across the Mediterranean began to pair students from different religious backgrounds in digital classrooms, where they studied the Crusades side by side, not as inheritors of blame, but as co-authors of a complex past that demanded empathy more than allegiance, where the question was no longer who was right, but how did this shape us, and how can we now reshape its shadow? In those dialogues, something remarkable began to happen. Stereotypes softened, anger gave way to curiosity, and the line between enemy and ancestor blurred just enough for compassion to enter. And perhaps most profoundly, individuals began to internalize the Crusades not as a distant historical anomaly, but as a warning against the eternal temptation of certainty, against the seductive simplicity of us versus them thinking. For history showed that the true casualties of such thinking were never only those who fell on battlefields, but also the possibilities of shared flourishing extinguished before they could blossom. Thus, the work of reckoning with the Crusades became not only an academic or diplomatic endeavor, but a deeply personal one, a spiritual archaeology that required each generation to excavate its own biases, to unearth the silent assumptions carried in language, law, and ritual, to question the stories they had been told about heroism, martyrdom, and divine favor, and to begin the slow, painful, but necessary work of reimagining identity not as opposition, but as relation. In this way, the Crusades, rather than fading into irrelevance, took on a new life, not as sacred cause or secular indictment, but as mirror, as cautionary tale, and as crucible in which the future might finally learn from the past, not to repeat it, but to transmute it into wisdom. And in the continued unfolding of this legacy, as the memory of the Crusades transitioned from a source of division to a crucible of contemplation, modern societies found themselves both haunted and guided by its echoes in ways not always visible on the surface, but deeply embedded in geopolitical posturing, interfaith dialogues, museum exhibitions, and even the architecture of international law. For within the legal frameworks that now governed warfare and humanitarian conduct, one could trace faint outlines of medieval codes of chivalry and religious exemption, now secularized yet still bearing the fingerprints of that age of holy violence. In fact, when contemporary leaders invoke the rhetoric of just war, moral intervention, or civilizational struggle, many were unwittingly resurrecting conceptual ghosts from the crusading era, dressed in the language of modernity, but animated by the same desire to cast conflict as divinely sanctioned or historically inevitable. And it became clear that unless these deeper patterns were acknowledged and critically unpacked, the Crusades would continue to exert a silent gravitational pull on the collective psyche, perpetuating binary worldviews that favored conflict over coexistence. Academic institutions responded by expanding Crusade studies beyond Eurocentric frameworks, inviting voices from the Islamic world, from Eastern Christianity, from Jewish communities caught between warring empires, and from post-colonial theorists who viewed the Crusades not merely as historical events, but as foundational myths in the architecture of Western imperialism. In doing so, they uncovered submerged narratives of women who acted as mediators, of local converts who challenged orthodox identities, of merchants who leveraged war to create new trade routes, of mystics who preached peace while kings waged war. And these voices, long silenced, offered a more nuanced and humane account of the era, one that complicated simple notions of good and evil, sacred and profane. Meanwhile, in popular culture, the Crusades underwent a transformation, no longer the sole domain of epic films glorifying knightly valor. They now appeared in dystopian novels as cautionary symbols of ideological obsession, in role-playing games that allowed players to inhabit multiple sides of the conflict and face moral ambiguity, and even in graphic novels where the clash of civilizations was reimagined as an allegory for modern identity crises, post-colonial guilt, and diasporic longing. Thus, the Crusades became a canvas upon which modern anxieties could be projected, explored, and sometimes exorcised, and in this creative reappropriation lay the seeds of healing. For to retell a story differently is to begin reshaping its power. Interfaith initiatives, too, drew from Crusader history, not to rekindle pain, but to address it, organizing pilgrimages where Christians, Muslims, and Jews walked the same routes not as rivals but as seekers, pausing at ruins where blood had been shed not to glorify it, but to mourn it, to pray in silence beneath fractured vaults and scorched minarets, to light candles not only for their own dead, but for all who had perished in the name of faith twisted into weaponry. And these moments, intimate, humble, untelevised, did more to subvert the Crusader legacy than any political summit or academic conference, for they enacted a quiet revolution of presence, of witness, of mutual vulnerability. And perhaps the most profound evolution occurred in the realm of memory itself. For the descendants of Crusaders and their former adversaries alike began to question the stories they had been told at home, to deconstruct national myths that painted ancestors as either infallible saints or eternal victims, and instead embraced a more honest reckoning with complexity, recognizing that every sword raised in holy war left behind not only corpses but questions, and that true strength lay not in denying the past, but in confronting it with courage, humility, and openness to growth. Thus, a new generation emerged, teachers who designed curricula that wove together Frankish, Arab, and Byzantine perspectives, curators who created exhibits where Crusader armor stood beside Muslim calligraphy and Jewish scrolls rescued from burning towns, poets who crafted verses in 3 languages to speak of shared loss and fragile hope, and parents who taught their children not to cheer for conquest, but to grieve its cost. And through these everyday acts of remembrance and resistance, the Crusades ceased to be merely a historical period and became a moral lens, a living parable about the dangers of certainty, the seduction of righteousness, and the possibility of redemption through dialogue. In this way, history did not repeat, but ripened, its fruits bitter at first, then sweetened by understanding, until even the ruins, those broken towers, those shattered mosaics, those cracked sarcophagi, began to hum with a different energy, not of triumph or lament, but of invitation, calling all who stood before them to listen closely, to dig deeper, and to walk forward carrying not the banner of crusade, but the quiet burden of peace. And as this quiet burden of peace began to settle into the consciousness of more communities around the world, a subtle transformation unfolded in how both institutions and individuals engaged with the legacy of the Crusades, not only as a historical chapter, but as a prism through which to examine modern dilemmas of identity, power, and belief. For in schools, teachers began to move beyond mere dates and battles, instead inviting students to trace the Crusades' echoes in modern borders, sectarian narratives, and diasporic tensions, encouraging them to see history not as a static archive, but as a living map etched into language, architecture, cuisine, and customs, where Arabic words like sugar, cotton, and zenith told stories of cultural exchange hidden beneath tales of conquest, and where medieval Latin chronicles could be read not just for glorification, but as artifacts of anxiety, propaganda, and longing for meaning in a chaotic world. In urban centers shaped by centuries of migration, community organizations hosted public forums titled whose holy land? Or faith in conflict, where refugees from Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon shared memories of ancestral cities that still bore Crusader walls alongside Ottoman domes and French colonial boulevards, reminding listeners that history never ends. It layers, it loops, it lingers. And this layering became especially important in cities like Jerusalem, Tripoli, or Acre, where sacred stones carried the fingerprints of empires long fallen but not forgotten, and where each claim of rightful inheritance bore the shadow of those medieval campaigns that had first baptized land with the language of divine entitlement. Artists, too, began to reinterpret these histories not through glorified reenactments, but through installations that juxtaposed chainmail armor with children's shoes, or that reimagined crusader processions as slow, mournful dances on scorched earth, or that displayed torn manuscripts beside LED screens flashing modern headlines about holy war, occupation, or radicalization, subtly insisting that the line between past and present was thinner than many dared admit. Even language evolved, as journalists and politicians who once casually invoked the term crusade to signify determination or moral clarity were increasingly challenged by scholars, faith leaders, and activists who reminded them of the term's deeply painful connotations in the Muslim world and beyond. And this push for linguistic responsibility was not about censorship, but about healing. A recognition that words carry histories, and that to use them carelessly is to perpetuate wounds unseen. At the grassroots level, interfaith families, Christian-Muslim couples raising children who lit candles for Advent and fasted during Ramadan, became quiet ambassadors of reconciliation, their lives testaments to the possibility of coexistence not in theory, but in kitchen conversations, in bedtime stories where prophets from multiple traditions walked side by side, in holiday tables where halal turkey was carved beside communion wine, and all were welcome. And these homes, humble and often unnoticed by the world, did more to rewrite the Crusades' legacy than any treaty or monument ever could. Meanwhile, digital spaces allowed for unprecedented collaborations between scholars in Istanbul, Cairo, Rome, and London who together annotated medieval texts in open-source projects, correcting mistranslations that had long justified hate, highlighting passages where Christian monks praised Muslim astronomers or where Muslim chroniclers admired the courage of Christian knights. And these virtual scriptoriums became sanctuaries of a new kind, cathedrals of code and compassion, where the sacred act of understanding replaced the violent impulse to dominate. In refugee camps, too, the Crusades found strange relevance. As displaced children traced family trees interrupted by war, their questions, why did they come? Why did they fight? Echoing those asked 900 years ago by villagers watching ships arrive with crimson crosses, and aid workers responded not with cynicism, but with stories of past resilience, of Andalusian gardens that bloomed after siege, of libraries rebuilt after fire, of peace treaties forged by former enemies who sat down not as victors and vanquished, but as equals who had both tasted loss. Thus, in the paradoxical fullness of this moment, the Crusades became neither a source of pride nor shame, but a shared inheritance to be handled with care, a fire that once burned but could now illuminate, and this illumination lit the way for new kinds of pilgrims. Not those who marched to reclaim tombs, but those who traveled to reclaim truth, who walked old roads to build new relationships, who studied ancient wounds not to reopen them, but to learn how they healed. And in this ongoing journey, the final word on the Crusades remained unwritten, waiting not for kings or popes or historians, but for each of us to decide, in the quiet choices of daily life, whether we would repeat the old patterns of division or become the unlikely authors of something better, more compassionate, more enduring. And as these unlikely authors of a new narrative began to step forward, students, artists, refugees, teachers, descendants of warriors and peacemakers alike, the very meaning of pilgrimage transformed from a physical journey to a moral one, from a march across blood-soaked lands to a quiet crossing into deeper empathy. And in this transformation, the world began to see the Crusades not only as wars of the past, but as metaphors for the conflicts within each of us, the tension between righteousness and humility, between memory and mercy, between revenge and restoration. Museums curated exhibitions that juxtaposed relics of the Crusades with contemporary photographs of destroyed mosques and churches in war-torn cities, allowing visitors to trace a thread of sacred architecture interrupted and resumed across centuries. Children stared at aged swords and then at modern news clippings, slowly realizing that violence never truly leaves. It simply changes form. Meanwhile, academic institutions launched Crusades and Consequences programs, inviting clerics, human rights lawyers, conflict resolution specialists, and psychologists to explore how inherited trauma shaped modern identity politics, how ancient grievances were still leveraged in populist rhetoric, and how the psychological scars of conquest could be passed down through generations, not just through stories, but through silences. In grassroots peace initiatives, descendants of both Crusaders and Saracens found themselves kneeling beside one another, planting olive trees on ancient battlegrounds, not to erase the past, but to root new life in it, each tree a fragile but defiant act of faith in the possibility of healing. And in these moments, tears often flowed more freely than words. For what words could truly contain the sorrow of so many centuries, or the hope born of touching hands across once murderous lines? And amid all of this, the digital world gave birth to communities that transcended borders, podcasts where historians and imams debated respectfully, virtual forums where young Jews, Christians, and Muslims shared family stories, images of old manuscripts annotated with emojis and insights, videos that reimagined Crusader sagas as cautionary tales about ego, fear, and unchecked power. Even video games and films began to shift their tone, moving from the glamorization of chivalric bloodshed to more nuanced, character-driven tales that questioned the morality of war, that portrayed Muslim heroes not as exotic adversaries, but as fully realized human beings with dreams, doubts, and dignity. And this cultural shift mattered, for the stories we tell about the past shape how we walk into the future. In some of the most surprising places, abandoned chapels in southern France, once bombed mosques in Aleppo now reopened as shelters, rooftop gardens in Jerusalem tended by Christian monks and Muslim orphans. New rituals emerged, rituals that drew from many faiths but were beholden to none, rituals where silence spoke louder than sermons, where the act of sitting together became an offering, and where forgiveness was not demanded but discovered slowly, like water finding its way through stone. And still the questions continued to deepen. What does it mean to protect the holy if in doing so we desecrate the humanity of others? Can a cause remain sacred if it requires hatred? What is victory if it leaves generations grieving? These were not questions for historians alone, but for lovers trying to bridge religious divides, for politicians drafting policy on refugee resettlement, for poets seeking to capture what cannot be said. And in this great reckoning, this pilgrimage of conscience that spanned continents and centuries, the Crusades evolved from an ancient tale of banners and blood into a mirror held up to the modern soul, reflecting our thirst for belonging, our fear of the other, our capacity for cruelty and compassion. They became not a single story but 1,000, overlapping like waves on sand, each one reshaping the one before it, until even the old stones of Jerusalem whispered not of war, but of weary hope. For in the end, perhaps the truest Holy Land is not a place we can claim with armies or arguments, but a space within us where we lay down our weapons, our prejudices, our inherited rage, our need to be right, and meet each other in the shared mystery of being human, of being wounded, of trying still to heal. And in that meeting, something ancient is finally undone, not erased, not forgotten, but redeemed. As this inner landscape of reconciliation grew, so too did the outward expressions of a world weary of conflict yet hungry for connection. Grassroots movements blossomed in cities once divided by sectarian lines, where artists painted murals blending crescent moons and crosses, where poets recited verses weaving together Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew in a single breath, and where children played games. invented to teach cooperation rather than conquest, and these small acts rippled outward, inspiring educational reforms that integrated the histories of all peoples touched by the Crusades, no longer sanitized or one-sided, but rich with the voices of those long silenced or marginalized. Universities partnered with local communities to develop programs that brought elders together with youth, creating spaces where oral histories met modern scholarship, fostering empathy through storytelling and shared meals, breaking down stereotypes with each conversation. While technology enabled virtual reality experiences that allowed users to walk the streets of Jerusalem in the 12th century or witness the perspectives of both knight and scribe, both merchant and monk, immersing a new generation in the complex humanity of the past. Meanwhile, theologians from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish traditions convened in unprecedented councils to explore not only the theological disputes that once fueled hatred, but the common spiritual threads that could weave a tapestry of peace, encouraging dialogues that addressed centuries-old grievances while emphasizing shared values of mercy, justice, and the sanctity of life. These efforts sparked a renaissance of interfaith collaboration, leading to joint humanitarian initiatives that transcended religious identity to address modern crises, refugee support, poverty alleviation, climate action, demonstrating that healing history could be a foundation for healing the world. The media, too, began to reflect this shift. Documentaries, novels, and films approached the Crusades not as mere historical spectacle, but as invitations to confront present-day biases and fears, encouraging viewers to question narratives of us versus them, and to recognize the shared struggles and aspirations that unite humanity across time and culture. In political arenas, though challenges persisted, diplomats increasingly referenced this evolving understanding as a guide for peace negotiations, acknowledging that sustainable solutions required more than treaties. They demanded a reckoning with historical wounds and a commitment to mutual recognition. Through all these intertwined efforts, a new language emerged, not one of domination or submission, but of respect and curiosity, where listening became as sacred as speaking, where silence was honored as a space for reflection rather than erasure, and where the quest for truth included embracing complexity and contradiction rather than simplifying the story into heroes and villains. And so the legacy of the Crusades, once a testament to division and destruction, transformed into a living dialogue, a continuous pilgrimage of hearts and minds toward a horizon where understanding might someday surpass enmity, where the echoes of old battles gave way to the sounds of laughter, music, and shared celebration. In this ongoing journey, the past was not shackled to the present, but liberated by it, reminding all who chose to listen that history is not fixed but fluid, shaped by those courageous enough to rewrite it with compassion. And in that rewriting, the Holy Land extended beyond geography into the sacred space of human connection, where every gesture of peace became a prayer, every act of kindness a beacon, and every story a step toward a world healed not by forgetting, but by remembering well and loving better. Building upon this transformative momentum, scholars and educators began to re-examine the Crusades not only as a sequence of military campaigns, but as a profound catalyst for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures between East and West, revealing how knowledge of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy traveled along with armies and pilgrims, enriching both civilizations despite the conflict. Ancient texts preserved in Arabic were translated into Latin, sparking a revival in European learning that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance. While architectural innovations, such as fortifications and water management techniques, found new expressions in castles and cities across Europe. This recognition fostered a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of human progress and underscored the tragedy of what was lost amid the violence. Museums and cultural institutions around the world began curating exhibitions dedicated to the nuanced histories of this period, showcasing artifacts that told stories of coexistence, as well as conquest, from intricately decorated manuscripts to everyday objects used by merchants, artisans, and pilgrims. These exhibitions became spaces for dialogue, inviting visitors to reflect on the complexity of cultural identity and the dangers of historical simplification. At the same time, artists and writers drew inspiration from the Crusades' rich tapestry of narratives to create works that transcended historical reenactment, blending myth and memory to explore themes of faith, power, betrayal, and redemption in ways that resonated with contemporary audiences grappling with issues of conflict and reconciliation in a globalized world. On the geopolitical stage, the legacy of the Crusades influenced diplomatic relations and intercultural diplomacy, encouraging leaders to acknowledge the deep historical roots of mistrust, but also the potential for healing through acknowledgement and respect. Peace-building efforts increasingly incorporated historical education as a tool for combating prejudice, understanding that sustainable peace required a collective memory that embraced truth and complexity rather than denial and distortion. Technology played a crucial role in this evolution, with digital archives and collaborative online platforms enabling researchers from diverse backgrounds to share sources, debate interpretations, and build a more inclusive historiography. Virtual reality experiences allowed people to step into the shoes of diverse historical actors, fostering empathy and breaking down the otherness that so often fuels conflict. Communities once divided by sectarianism began organizing joint commemorations, not to celebrate conquest, but to mourn loss and to honor resilience, creating new traditions rooted in mutual respect and shared humanity. These rituals, whether public festivals, interfaith prayers, or educational programs, contributed to healing wounds passed down through generations and offer a model for addressing historical grievances worldwide. Meanwhile, younger generations, growing up in an era of unprecedented connectivity, embraced these efforts with curiosity and hope, recognizing that the stories of the Crusades were not distant echoes, but living lessons on the consequences of fear, intolerance, and unchecked ambition. They found in this history a call to courage, to challenge narratives of division, to seek justice without vengeance, and to build bridges across differences with humility and compassion. Thus, the story of the Crusades continued to unfold, not as a closed chapter of the past, but as a dynamic and ongoing journey toward understanding, reconciliation, and peace, reminding all who listen that even the darkest histories can give rise to light when met with open hearts and minds committed to learning, growth, and the enduring power of human connection. As the centuries unfolded, the echoes of the Crusades continued to shape societies, inspiring both caution and aspiration in equal measure, reminding humanity that the intertwining of faith, power, and identity is a delicate dance fraught with both peril and possibility. The lessons gleaned from this turbulent era became foundational in the development of modern concepts of coexistence, tolerance, and the rule of law, as people gradually came to understand that no single narrative holds the absolute truth, and that embracing complexity is essential for genuine peace. Today, scholars, artists, diplomats, and everyday people alike draw from this vast well of history to confront contemporary challenges, whether it be religious extremism, cultural misunderstandings, or geopolitical strife, recognizing that the past is not simply a record of what was, but a living guide illuminating what might be. Through education, dialogue, and the fostering of empathy across borders and beliefs, the legacy of the Crusades serves as a profound reminder that human history is woven from countless threads of conflict and cooperation, despair and hope, destruction and renewal. In this spirit, communities worldwide endeavor to honor the memory of those who lived, fought, and dreamed during those pivotal times, ensuring that their stories continue to inspire a commitment to justice, compassion, and the enduring quest for a world where diverse peoples can coexist in harmony, celebrating both their differences and their shared humanity. Thus, the saga of the Crusades, with all its triumphs and tragedies, stands not only as a chapter of the distant past, but as a timeless mirror reflecting the challenges and possibilities of the human condition, inviting each generation to learn, to grow, and to strive toward a future shaped by understanding rather than division, by peace rather than war, and by the unbreakable bonds that connect us all.